Geographers study the interactions between humans and the environment. There are a variety of subdisciplines within the field, including geographers who study physical geography, regional geography, and human geography. Military geography is a subfield used by academics and politicians to understand the relationships between humans and their terrain through a military lens. In this interview, you will hear from Dr. Eugene Palka, a specialist in the field of military geography and a retired U.S. Army colonel with more than 33 years of military experience. As you watch this video, think about the interactions people have with their natural environments. Consider how returning veterans' experiences might be colored by the geographic regions to which they return, and think about the skills that social geographers apply to solving problems as you listen to examples from Dr. Palka's career. In particular, consider the concepts of cultural landscapes and activity mapping, and think of ways you might be able to apply them when exploring veterans' identities, cultures, and experiences. All right, Dr. Palka, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Travis.
Appreciate you being a part of this series of interviews to help our veteran study students learn about a different variety of perspectives to use in trying to understand veterans' identities, cultures, and experiences. And you bring to us not only the perspective of a military veteran, but also the perspective of a professor of geography. And so you've had a storied career. Like, if you don't have a memoir written already, you should probably write one. Athlete, 33 years in the military.
33.
Tenured professor of geography, chair of the department. Now you're the vice president for student success here at EKU.
Right.
Just tell us a little bit about yourself, like why you joined the military and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Thanks, Travis. To be honest, I joined the military to play football. I was recruited by the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And my dream at that point in my life was to play in the Army-Navy game on TV. And I really wasn't aware of what the life afterwards held for me. But I graduated in '78, commissioned in the infantry as a second lieutenant, and for the next 33 and a half years just had a wonderful career and was really blessed with some great assignments, raised a family along the way. And when I retired in 2011, we circled back to Kentucky. Had lived previously for 6 years at Fort Campbell and 3 years at Fort Knox, and so we had lived in Kentucky just as long as any place else. And our children were both born here and later went to high school here, so this was a great place for us to finally put down roots.
Good, and we're definitely glad to have you here. I know as a professor of geography, you were chair of the department, but you also got to apply your expertise in some pretty special ways while you were in the military. I know when you deployed especially, you've told me stories about what you did. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. I've always said I was a better infantryman because I was a geographer, and quite frankly a better geographer because I was a soldier. I graduated from the U.S. Military Academy, and we didn't have majors. We all received a Bachelor of Science in Engineering. But my master's degree was in geography and my PhD in geography. And it was during my time as a professor and chair of the department at West Point when I was asked to deploy to Afghanistan. Not as an infantryman, not as an operations officer, but because I was an environmental geographer. Had that same opportunity. That occurred in 2002. Went back in 2005 and 2008 to Afghanistan, and then asked to do the same thing in 2009 by deploying to Iraq. And in both cases, again, I was there because I understood a little bit about the natural environment and the people who live there, but I also understood the challenges and problems that those environments, human and natural, would pose to military operations. And so over the years, it was really the intersection of geography and military science where I found a niche as a military geographer.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about that geography is the study of interactions between people and their environment. But maybe for our students who haven't taken a geography class or who are looking to use, the perspectives of geographers in the study of veterans, could you maybe just kind of break down what it is professors of geography study, research,
Sure.
et cetera?
Unlike a lot of disciplines, geographers don't have subject matter per se that they can lay claim to. They offer spatial perspectives. And so normally we use a universal definition that geographers study the surface of the earth and the atmosphere as the home of humanity. So there are purists who are physical geographers, there are purists who are human geographers. I was that fence straddler, and I was always focused on those interactions. Now, where geography as a discipline overlaps with other disciplines, you have distinct subfields. So, for example, geography overlaps with economics, and we have something called economic geography. Where it overlaps with political science, we have political geography. Where it overlaps with biology, we have biogeography. So my focus was on the overlap between geography and military science, and we call that military geography. So I was always looking at the intersections, and I was always looking at taking geographic information, tools, and techniques to solving military problems. And those military problems could be in peacetime or wartime or somewhere in between in operations other than war.
And maybe you have an example of how you applied those techniques and skills?
Sure. For example, one of the largest installations on the East Coast is Fort Jackson. And we conduct basic training, advanced individual training, one station unit training at Fort Jackson. Out in the training area, it also happens to be habitated by the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is an endangered species. So as a soldier, I want to be able to use those training areas, but the environmental geographer in me wants to protect the habitat of that endangered species. So by going out into the field and mapping the types of vegetation in the trees where those red-cockaded woodpeckers would nest and congregate, we could plot those on the map, and we could draw buffers around those and create, using a geographic information system, a series of overlays so that we could both protect the habitat and use the training area. We do the same thing out in Fort Irwin, where we have a prevalence of the desert tortoise. Same technique enables the tortoise to live undisturbed and yet continue to use the training lands as a valuable training resource. So those are peacetime applications for that type of where you're combining the understanding of the natural environment with the military training scenarios. When we look at humanitarian assistance missions, it's not wartime, it's not peacetime, they're somewhere in between. But oftentimes, I remember a few years ago where we were providing aid to folks who had their homelands ravaged in Indonesia because of a tsunami, a record tsunami. And one of the most important things was to be able to provide food and potable water. And we did so by using large cargo aircrafts, but the choice of foodstuffs was not as easy as one might think. The easiest thing to do was to pull meals ready to eat out of the warehouses on Army installations and provide those. They're already packaged, they have a long shelf life, easy to distribute, come in all kinds of varieties. However, that is an overwhelmingly Muslim nation, and most of the MREs were pork-based. So that would have been a tremendous mistake had we not understood that. So I've been involved with those kinds of things. I had been part of an environmental team of scientists to travel throughout the tropic regions of the world to find the most challenging environments to test military equipment, uniforms, communications, gear, weapon systems, munitions, foodstuffs, and even human performance. That research agenda, which I had for about 10 or 12 years while I was at West Point, took me to places like Panama and Honduras and Suriname, Australia, and a number of other places to find suitable locations to test all of our equipment in extreme environments. And we did that for the R&D communities so that they could adequately equip soldiers prior to deployment, not during deployment.
Sure. So the geographer is a person who goes out to a situation, a place, analyzes the people, their culture, their perspectives, and their imprint that they leave on the environment, and also analyzing the environment, you know, like you said, the ground and the air, and trying to find a way to understand the intersections between those.
Yes.
And so from any kind of situation, like trying to determine what uniform to wear to trying to build a base that doesn't threaten an endangered species, that's what a geographer would do. So students in this course, Intro to Veteran Studies, what we're trying to do is equip them with a variety of disciplinary perspectives. So as a geographer, you know, your basic perspectives that you kind of use in your discipline, and we've talked a lot about those already, but what I'm trying to do basically is to bring in experts from their fields and equip the students with one or two basic concepts or skills that they can go take and apply to veterans' issues, experiences, text, and situations to better understand what veterans go through. So I'm just wondering maybe if you could share some basic concepts or skills from the field of geography that our students might be able to use.
Sure. Two that readily come to mind are the notions of cultural landscape and activity space. Think of the cultural landscape as the human imprint on the natural landscape. So first we can analyze the natural landscape void of any humans or human activity. And we take that pristine environment and then we superimpose in a sequential fashion the occupants who live there, work there, maybe farm there. And so they mold that landscape to suit their needs. That, of course, becomes their autobiography, and it reflects their successes as well as their failures. So you may have skyscrapers and extensive highways or aqueducts, but you may also have lands that have been ravaged by strip mining or garbage thrown about. And so for a soldier, what's important is to be able to deploy to new locations and quickly decode that cultural landscape. It's easy to understand the natural landscape by reading a book, and you can study about it. But where it becomes complicated is where people are involved. So for example, if you travel to a place like Iraq or Afghanistan, where we spent considerable amount of time recently, most activities occur in urban areas in Iraq because there's nobody living in the rural areas. But yet when you go to those urban areas, you see centuries of development. You see mosques that are positioned in a certain location. You see a different type of land ownership. You see a different way of getting rid of garbage or bringing in water. You see a different way of segregating people. The construction of houses differs considerably from what you would see here. The width of roads and the networking of roads is far more complex. And so you have to figure all of that out. And you have to do that time and again, wherever you go. And so I think for a veteran, most veterans become somewhat of an expert in doing that subconsciously over time. And you really never leave it behind you. But it enables you to develop a way to become at ease with your surroundings wherever you go. It takes a little time, but you can eventually figure it out. The idea of activity space. We could take your daily routine, my daily routine, and we could plot from the time we wake up in the morning to the time we go to bed in the evening on a map, exactly the ground that we cover. Geographers would refer to that aerial extent, if you connect the dots, as your activity space. Well, we can go one step further. For example, for me, I live about 8 blocks from campus, so I get up at 5:45, I leave the house at 7 a.m. sharp, Monday through Friday. I drive into the Maddox lot. I get out of the truck and walk into the Whitlock building. From Whitlock throughout the morning, I'm all over campus. Guarantee I'm going to Starbucks or Einstein's at 12 noon for that Java. The afternoon again keeps me on campus, but then I go home, let's say 5 o'clock, a quick bite to eat, and then I travel outside of Richmond to Union City Road to a small horse farm where we keep our horses. Spend the time out there and then take the same route back through town and return to my house. We can draw that on the map, that route, and we can also attach a timeline to that. For me, that expands on weekends as I may go to Lexington or Louisville or someplace else, or the occasional trip. But that activity space in those daily routines tells geographers, how someone is interacting with the natural environment as well as that cultural landscape which constitutes their habitat. So for soldiers, that becomes critically important. As we have been to Iraq together, we know well that you don't want to follow those same routines, leaving a forward operating base and heading out on a mission. You want to alternate the times, the locations, the stops, the formations, and so on and so forth. Because if you don't do that and the pattern is recurring, then you put yourself at risk. At the same time, though, we have to understand how those other residents who live there, non-combatants who live there, what their routines are, so we don't interfere with them and therefore alienate them. So these concepts that are important to the geographer have always been concepts that are equally important to soldiers, especially those who are deploying.
Okay. And I'm going to follow up maybe about each one of those concepts, first with the cultural landscape issue. We've talked previously about this, about how there's this idea that veterans have a unique culture all their own. And you've said that you agree with as much as that. And that's kind of what the basis of veterans studies is that people go into the military and something happens during service that kind of transforms them into the member of a new collective, of a new culture. And when we're talking about cultural landscape and we're talking about trying to understand the needs of veterans when they come home from service, what might a geographer say or speculate in terms of the intersections between that unique veteran culture and the civilian culture they're returning to?
I agree 100% that veterans constitute a unique, I would call them, subculture. It's interesting too because most military organizations represent a cross-section of members who may come from any of the 50 states or overseas. Mm-hmm. But I think it's the common experience and the common set of core values that bring them together. And I refer those as centripetal or unifying forces. And so while they may still have their own identity as members of that subculture, they have a lot of commonalities. And one of the most fundamental ways to unite a people is to share hardship. So that hardship could be demanding physical fitness training. It could be uncomfortable conditions out in a training area. It could be lousy food in the mess hall. or it could be a deployment where everyone is away from home. And what happens, people become closer, they become more united, they rely on each other, and so they become more alike than they are different. When they leave those settings, though, they oftentimes are a little distraught because you don't necessarily have those same kinds of hardships. I always joke when things go poorly at EKU, instead of people uniting and coming together, it's everyone for themselves. That's exactly opposite in the military, specifically in the Army, which is our experience. Yeah. That's when people come together. So I think when you leave the service, though, there's a natural tendency to look for others who can share to some degree some of those common experiences. Not everybody needs that. Some of us perhaps are more independent than others, and we can draw from our memories, or we can maintain ties with folks who live elsewhere. But others are often in search of those opportunities to come together, to participate in some activity, or just have a conversation.
Yeah, you kind of just stirred up a bush and made like 3 rabbits pop out, and I could chase each one down a hole there. I think a sociologist would probably talk about this in terms of the differences between collectivist and individualistic cultures, and veterans are coming from a collectivist culture into an individualistic culture. And you've described one tie that binds veterans together as commiseration, kind of shared suffering and kind of coming together and growing stronger as a result of teamwork and camaraderie and things like that. I'm interested, as someone who studies veterans and works in veteran studies, in ways to bring veteran and civilian cultures together, because veterans just say again and again that they don't feel like they're a part of society when they return. They feel like outsiders and things like this. And at the same time, society kind of places them in an exceptional position where they're heroes and they're vaunted for their service, And so I guess the question is, like, how do we make veterans and civilians commiserate more so that they'll come closer together?
I think the first thing you have to do is set aside stereotypes.
Yeah.
And time and again, I talk with student veterans who really just want to be students.
Yep.
They're proud of the veteran status, and deep down inside, they, will always remember those experiences. But they want to compete on equal ground with other students here, and they want to be treated the same way. There are other veterans, however, who will carry a helmet bag that has every patch of the unit to which they were assigned. They will have their high and tight haircut, and there will be a skull ring in the back pocket. And you can look at the way they present themselves, the way they carry themselves, the way they walk, and you could say that's a vet. And so those folks have a little difficult time reaching across the boundary and joining hands. On the other hand, we have an equal number who want to just hang out at Starbucks, go to class, go to the football games, blend in with the other students, and just to be judged as a student. I don't know if you can ever get folks to really cross over fully. I think it's just a matter of mutual respect and open communications and setting aside stereotypes. I think that's the best you can do, because we can have different events when we host the Veterans Picnic. You either served or you didn't. And although other administrators on campus will show up and they will be really good sports about supporting the event, and they will be genuinely sincere, most of them realize they're not part of the club. And the same is true for, quite frankly, folks like me. I can sit among members of the President's Council and we can all wear a tie and be dressed up, and we're charged with administrative abilities that are interconnected and critical for running the university. But when push comes to shove, there are some core values that become important to me, and no excuses, and never missing a suspense, and being punctual, and let's compromise and work at it until we get it done. Mission success. Those aren't values that others look at in the same way as I do. So we're never going to be quite the same. We just have to, I think, respect each other for what we bring to the table.
Okay, so we need to find ways for
Boy,
veterans.
you really took me off on a tangent.
No. Tangents are great because they lead to like 100 different conversations. But yeah, kind of finding ways to integrate veteran culture into larger society. It's a subculture that's part of a larger culture than, and it's comes from the cross section of people that join the military and then have that transformative experience, and they return home as members of a new culture, and then we're trying to find ways to integrate the veteran, to make them feel welcome, not make them give up or assimilate, but rather integrate.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we'll probably have to talk about more in our coursework.
Sure.
But regarding your second basic concept, activity space, I wonder it may be hard for, an intro to veteran studies student who's never taken a geography course in their life to do this, but I'm wondering if you could make any suggestions about applying that technique maybe to the study of veterans. Where might someone start?
Yeah. I think it's an easy thing to do. If you took a Madison County map and put it in front of each student, or a Richmond map, or campus map, and you say, okay, for each hour of the day, put a dot where you're located on that map. I think you'll find that there are some places that folks don't go, and some places that they gravitate to. And there are some spaces that are more appealing and welcoming. There are others where maybe they don't want to frequent that location. And a fundamental concept in geography is to be able to change the scale of analysis. We can have a geography of this room. We can have a geography of Kentucky. We can have a geography of the United States. We can have a geography of North America, the world. You can change the scales. For example, when traffic is stacked up on I-75, north or south of here, I don't want to be in that middle lane. I've been stuck in those predicaments in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. I want to be on an outer lane, preferably the far right-hand lane so I can get off the road. When I go into a restaurant, quite frankly, I don't want to be seated with my back to the door or the kitchen or any other activity. I'm more comfortable seated in the corner looking out. There are certain pathways and routes that folks will take. I mean, there were times as a deployed soldier where you were not going to head down a certain boulevard during when the marketplace was in session and be canalized into a dead end or have to contend with a herd of sheep that were passing through and you're at an impasse. I still think that way. If my son were here, my son is a four times he deployed to Iraq for year-long tours. He probably wouldn't attend the fireworks over at Lake Reba. So there are go areas and no-go areas, just like we place on military maps, I believe, for veterans when you're in a combat situation, but also when you come home. That mindset, I think, stays with you. And so if you had students plot where they go, connect the dots so that you have an aerial extent, and then you can bore down a little bit closer. Why do you go here? Is it the VFW or the Legion Club? Why not over here or over here? What restaurants do you go to? you know, I think it's something that could be revealing if you go through the exercise.
Absolutely. So you could study the activity and therefore ask questions that would lead you to a deeper understanding
Exactly.
of the person. You know, as someone who, you know, background in English, I could see like doing a meta-analysis of books about veterans and stories about veterans and kind of mapping the different locations that the veteran characters are described within. That could be
Right.
interesting. So
Yeah.
interdisciplinarity, that's kind of what we're all about here. Final question, just basically, are there any other recommendations based upon your experiences or as a professor of geography that you might have for our students in veteran studies to help them better understand those experiences, identities, and cultures?
Yeah, I think one of the things that immediately comes to mind is that you have to understand the perspective of the other. No one is stupid. No one intentionally makes mistakes. When you look at how people inhabit a landscape, how they design their house, how they cut their hay, how they travel, I mean, they are making conscious decisions that make sense within the context of their environment. So before you jump to conclusions and believe that, wow, we have a better way here in the U.S., we might for us, and what we do might not be practical at all somewhere else in the world. So I think the number one thing I try to do is understand the perspective of the other. And a great lesson from Afghanistan. I was there at a time when villages to the north of where we were located experienced an earthquake. And all of the mud-baked houses slid down the side of the mountains. It was an avalanche. In the midst of Operation Anaconda, we tried to provide humanitarian assistance to those individuals. And what we did is we ordered what we called Home Depot kits. And these were prefabbed houses made of wood that were packaged as kits, loaded onto C-17 aircrafts, brought into Bagram, and we were able to shuttle these with either flatbeds or Chinook helicopters. Well, we delivered them on day one. By day three, virtually all of them were burned. Made no sense to the soldiers delivering these Home Depot kits. Made perfect sense to the Afghanis. They used the wood for fuel. It was for heat. It was in the middle of the winter. They needed it for cooking. Wood was already scarce. It made great sense. That was the priority. They don't build in wood. They build in mud. So, you know, you think about that, made no sense to us. It was very logical for them to burn those kits as fuel wood. So I think understanding the importance of the other is, and having an open mind and try to, always trying to contextualize is a lesson learned.
So what's logical to the veteran within the context of their experience and background?
Well, for the veteran, I think it starts by, if you have had the chance to move about the country, even if you haven't deployed, living at Fort Benning, Georgia, and understanding that cultural landscape is much different than living at Fort Lewis, Washington, outside of Seattle, Tacoma. I think the same thing is true when you transition from a military base where you may have lived. That's a unique cultural landscape that's highly structured. It's clean, it's orderly, it's overly organized. And then when you move in off post, as we would say, it sometimes appears to be chaotic. And so you again have to figure out the code there.
So just keep exploring what's unique to the veteran's experience, and we'll understand them better. Try to put them in the context rather than expecting them to conform to ours.
Right, exactly.
Well, Dr. Palka, I thank you for coming today.
Dr. Martin, thank you.
This has been a great interview, and I appreciate you being a part of this course.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
All right.